In lesson 1, we looked at how to convert in between our metric system. In lesson 2, we looked how to convert within our imperial system. In lesson 3, we're going to do something called interconversions, and that means that we're going to go back and forth between the different systems. So you'll notice here that we have some basic conversions between the systems. So it's a little bit different because we don't have the arrows that are like pointing from one direction to the other and telling us whether to multiply or divide. So it's actually going to be a little bit like how we set up some of our ratios or proportions, or a little bit how we kind of set up our foreign exchange and our consumer decision. So let's just jump right in and we'll refer back to the chart as we need to. So example 1A, convert between the systems, so 6 pounds to kilograms. So we're going to do a little bit of work off on the side here. It's not going to be as easy as just kind of deciding what to write right in the question. So for questions like this, you might actually want to grab a whiteboard to give yourself a little bit of space. I'm going to do the work off on the side, but if you're doing the work for the practice, it might be easier to have more space, and you can use one of the little whiteboards from the front. So I'm going to look up here at my conversions, and I'm going to look for any conversion between pounds and kilograms. So what we should notice for the first question is we're going to use this conversion here. So how we set this up is a little bit different. We start with 6 pounds. And then what we're going to do is we're going to write times, and then we're going to put a little line. Okay? Now, we're always going to set it up this way. And the trick is whatever units that you're starting with, so whatever units are first, the same units have to be on the bottom of what you're multiplying by. The other units that you're converting to are going to go on the top. The reason for this is if you have pounds on the top with your 6 and then you have a pounds on the bottom, these are going to actually be able to cancel out, and we're going to be left with an answer in kilograms. Now, once we decide where we're putting the pounds and the kilograms, we're going to look up here at our conversion, and we can see that 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So wherever we put the kg, we're going to put the number 1. Wherever we put the pounds, we're going to put the number 2.2. So wherever we put the kg, we put a 1. Wherever we put the pounds, we put a 2.2. So this is, we can now see that the pounds can cancel, and our answer will be left in kilograms. So what we're actually doing here is 6 times 1 divided by 2.2. You don't need to rewrite it that way. I'm just showing you kind of how this falls out. 6 times 1 is 6, divided by 2.2, and we get 2.73 kilograms. So that's really it. That's how we're going to set up every single question. And we just need to find the appropriate conversion from the chart above. So let's look at the next one. So we're going from liters to gallons. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write 65 liters times with a fraction line. If liters is what I started with, then that means I need to have liters on the bottom so that it will cancel. And if I'm trying to go to gallons, then that means that I'm going to put gallons US on the top. Now we're going to look above, and we're going to ask ourselves, where can we find a conversion that goes between liters and US gallons? So we're looking for liters and US gallons. So we should find this formula right here. So this formula tells me wherever I put the word gallon, whether it's the top or the bottom, that's where the number 1 will go. And wherever I put the L, that's where the 3.785 will go. So now we can see again that our liters is going to cancel, and our answer will be left in gallons, US gallons, American, US. 65 times 1 divided by 3.785. So really you don't need to worry about multiplying by 1. You're just going to do 65 divided by 3.785, and that's going to give you an answer of 17.17. All right, let's try the next one. 10 ounces to grams. Okay, now this should actually be Canadian ounces. So let's just make a note. Okay, so we're going to start with 10 ounces times our blank. We're going to put ounces on the bottom, and then we're going to put grams on the top. so let's look above now. I'm going to erase this highlighting. Okay, and we are looking for a conversion between grams and ounces. So that's going to be up here. 28.4 grams is 1 ounce. So if grams is on the top, the 28.4 is the number that goes with grams. That will be on the top. 1 ounce is on the bottom. What you should notice is, once again, the ounces will cancel and we'll be left with an answer in grams. So this one, because of the way I position the numbers, this ends up being 10 times 28.4. So we can't always say you multiply by the conversion, you divide by the conversion, because again, whether you multiply or divide depends on which direction you're going. So this is why always setting this up, as long as you're making sure you're canceling out the units and placing the numbers in the appropriate spot, you'll be able to figure out whether you're multiplying or dividing. So 10 times 28.4 is 284. All right, so I'm going to get you to take a minute to try the next one. 412 kilometers to miles. So you're starting with 412 kilometers times, and you're doing your blank. So go ahead and think about how you're going to place your kilometers and your miles here. So you should be putting km on the bottom and mi on the top. Now, when we go to our chart, the one thing I want to point out is that you'll notice that there's actually is 2 different conversions with miles and kilometers. So depending on which one you choose, you actually might get a very, very tiny difference in your answer. It shouldn't be huge. So I'm going to show you what happens when I pick the first one. So I'm going to pick 1 mile equals 1.61 kilometers. So 1 mile is 1.61 kilometers. So this ends up being 412 times 1, which I don't need to worry about doing, divided by 1.61. So this ends up being 255.9. Okay. Now, I want to show you what will happen if you choose the other conversion. 412 kilometers times, we're setting it up exactly the same. But if I choose the second conversion, 1 kilometer equals 0.62 miles, then the 1 kilometer is on the bottom and the 0.62 miles is on the top. And in this case, I end up doing 412 times 0.62. You should always get approximately the same answer. It might be off by a few decimals. So I'm going to erase that just for space sake, but I just wanted to show you that if there's 2 conversions that are the same, you could do either one. You just might need to pay attention to a slightly different answer. Okay? All right. Take a minute to try E. So you should be setting up fluid ounces on the bottom and milliliters on the top. You're going to go up to the chart and you're going to look for the conversion. You should notice that 1 fluid ounce is 28.41 milliliters. So let's put our numbers in the appropriate spot. So this ends up being a multiplication question. 12 times 28.41 is 340.92 milliliters. Okay. All right, go ahead and try F. Since you're starting in inches, make sure that when you times by your fraction, your conversion fraction, you have inches on the bottom and centimeters on the top. If you look at your conversions above, 1 inch equals 2.5 centimeters. So 1 inch should be on the bottom to match the units, 2.5 centimeters on the top. So this ends up being multiplication. 26 times 2.54, 66.04. All right, go ahead and try G. So you could probably see what I mean when I'm saying these take up a little bit more space, and you might prefer to do some of the work on the whiteboard and then just kind of recopy it a little bit smaller on the paper if you don't like it feeling so crammed. So here we're using that same 1 inch equals 2.5 centimeters, but since we're starting in centimeters, the way that we set up our ratio, the 1 inch is on the top and the 2.54 centimeters is on the bottom. So this ends up becoming a division question instead of multiplication like the previous one. Okay. So H, we have 26 miles. We want to go to kilometers. So we're going to put miles on the bottom and kilometers on the top. So this is very similar to D, where we went from kilometers to miles, in the sense that this is one that has those two different options for a conversion rate. So really it's up to you which one you want to use. I'm going to use the fact that 1 mile equals 1.61 kilometers to make it a multiplication. If you use the other one, you're going to end up dividing by 0.62 if you use the fact that 1 kilometer is 6.2 miles. Again, if it helps you to double check your units, you can show how they cancel, you can show what you're ending up with, and you're going to end up with 41.86 kilometers. Now I'm going to actually add another question here. The one thing you might have noticed is all the questions that we just did had one step. There was a direct conversion to get from pounds to kilograms, liters to gallons, ounces to grams. That's not always going to be the case. So let's look at an example. 74 miles to centimeters. If you look up at your chart here, the one thing you'll notice is there's no conversion directly from miles to centimeters. So this is one of those cases where you're going to have to first convert to something that you know within that system. So we're going from imperial, miles, to metric, centimeters. So if I can't go from miles to centimeters, what can I go to in my metric system? And what you might notice is, is again, I can go from miles to kilometers. Well, if I can get to kilometers, then based on what I know from lesson 1, I can go from kilometers to centimeters using what I know about multiplying or dividing by 10, 100, or 1,000. So this would just be a multi-step question. So we're going to start with 75 miles. And even though this question wants us to eventually convert to centimeters, because we don't have a direct conversion, we're going to start by converting to kilometers. So I'm going to use the fact that 1 mile is 1.61 kilometers. So let's just start off by finding out how many kilometers this is. So this is just a multiplication. 119.14, and now I'm in kilometers. If you go to your formula sheet and you look at your conversion from kilometers to centimeters, you can see that that's another two-step conversion, but it's a lot easier because we have the arrows to follow along that tell us to first times by 1,000 to get to meters, and then times by 100 to get to centimeters. So we would then end up with a final answer of 11,914,000 centimeters. So this is just an example of a two-step question because they won't always be directly one to another, directly as we see in our conversion chart. Okay, so let's try some word problems. Example 2, the speed of light in a vacuum is defined as 299,792 kilometers per second. Change that into miles per second. So it's directly telling me, take the kilometers you're given and change it to miles. So let's start with our kilometers. We want to change it to miles. So as soon as we recognize that kilometers to miles is an interconversion, we know that we can't just use the formulas with the arrows on our formula sheet. We've got to think about setting this up as a proportion. So we're going to have kilometers on the bottom. There is a direct relation. So we can do this in one step. I'm going to use 1 mile as 1.61 kilometers, but remember this is one of those cases where you do have two options, which might slightly change your final answer. So this ends up being a division question. 186,206, 106.21 miles per second. Make sure when you're talking about miles, you use MI. Please don't use M. M is meters, MI is miles. So you have to be really careful with that because it means two different things. Okay. How many 125 milliliter glasses can be filled from a can that contains 2 pints of liquid? So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to make my 125 milliliters into a different unit. So notice that the milliliters is metric, the pints of liquid is imperial. So what we want to do is we want to compare them. So I am going to convert both of these to fluid ounces. Okay. And I'm going to do American fluid ounces. So I'm going to start with the 125 milliliters, and I am going to convert this into 1 fluid ounce. So 1 fluid ounce US is equal to 29.57 milliliters. This is just from my conversion chart. Okay. So this now gets me into my imperial system, which is the same as where my pints are. So I have two choices at this point. I can now take the 4.23 fluid ounces, right? And I can go ahead and continue to convert that to pints. Or I can take the 2 pints and convert that to fluid ounces. So you don't need to directly go from one to the other if you're comparing something. You can just take the 2 measurements that you have and you can convert them into the same measurement. So let's take the 2 pints and let's convert that to fluid ounces. Now notice I'm setting this up differently because pints to fluid ounces is within the same system. So this is where I just need to go look at those arrows and see what do I need to do to get from pints to fluid ounces, and that's times 8 times 2. So I end up with 32 fluid ounces. Okay. So I need to fill a can that's 32 fluid ounces using a glass that's 4.23 fluid ounces. So I need to know how many glasses. So you need to take your total, which is your 32 fluid ounces, divided by how much each glass can hold. Notice that if you've done this correctly, these units should be the same so that they cancel. 32 divided by 4.23 is 7.53. Now note, okay, you cannot have part of a glass. So I'm taking the 2 pints of liquid and I want to know how many glasses I can fill. So in this case, even though it says 7.53, and I would tend to want to round up to 8, I can't fill 8 full glasses. I don't have enough. I can only fill 7 glasses. I can put liquid in the 8th glass, but it won't be full. So like I said, there are different ways you could do this question. You could have taken the 423 fluid ounces and then you could have just converted it to pints, and then you would have been comparing that answer to the 2 pints given in the question. It's just a different method. So if you're interested, you could try it. You should get the same answer. All right, example 4. How many liters of paint are there in 5 US gallons? Round your answer to 1 decimal place. Okay, so we're taking 5 US gallons. And we want to convert that into liters. So you're going to look at your formula sheet. We're converting between systems. So notice the difference in how we set it up. When we're staying within the same system, we can just do the multiplication or division based on the arrows. But when we're going between the systems and we're using these conversion numbers, there's no arrows here. So to know whether we're multiplying or dividing, we really need to set this question up properly. So we're going to put US gallons on the bottom and we're going to put liters on the top. You're going to find your conversion on your chart. 1 US gallon is 3.875 liters. So now you need to think about where will the 1 go, where will the 3.875 go. That's why I like to place the units first. 1 US gallon is 3.875 liters. So we can see that our gallons cancel and our liters ends up being our final answer. This will be a multiplication question. 5 times 3.875, and we're rounding to 1 decimal, so 18.9 liters. So this one is definitely more complicated than when we stick within the same system. We have a lot more to think about when we're converting between the systems, and it also makes the word problems a little bit more challenging as well. That's lesson 3.